and welcome to Get the Table, another wrestling roundtable discussion podcast with myself, Adam Wilborn, and the Dadley Boyz of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, here to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts, where we not only review Raw and SmackDown, but also the Wednesday Night War between AEW and NXT. Pay-per-views, we have interviews, more roundtable discussions like this one, and a roundup of the week, complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. As I said, though, joined by Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick. And gents, we are gathered here today to talk about WrestleMania matches that never happened. So many tantalizing matches out there that have either been teased or even, in some cases, advertised, and then they never came to fruition. Michael Hamflett, when I say something like that to you, what pops in your head?
Mr. Kennedy had a bad year, didn't he? 2007, things really went wrong for old Mr. Kennedy. He was a guy from the ruthless aggression era, and that's been a popular talking point lately, that genuinely, earnestly was over. Yes, it turned out in hindsight when you watch it back, he was cribbing a lot of his best bits from Steve Austin and The Rock, but then they're good people to steal from. They were overstars from the prior. You don't look around your colleagues in 2007 and think, what can I steal from? What's Carlito doing that I could do? You know, so at least he was looking in the right direction. However, a series of really unfortunate events cost him. He won Money in the Bank at WrestleMania 23, and he came out the very next night on Raw, and in quite an unprecedented move for a relatively young gimmick at the time, said, I'm going to cash this in 1 year's time. He had Vince McMahon's middle name as his surname, and for a bit of a while his first name. He was a made man, and he had a guaranteed title shot, and it genuinely seemed like they were going to go with it. And then he got injured and misdiagnosed, and in a panic, they took it off him 24 hours after the diagnosis, and he came back 2 months later instead of a year. And then he made some ill-advised comments in the media, and then his push collapsed, and then he got suspended for a wellness policy violation. And the very next year, at that WrestleMania, where he was going to be fighting for the title, he was back in the Money in the Bank match again, which he lost. It's not funny. It's not funny. It's dark wrestling humour, but it's just another case with him of what could have been. There was a lot of what could have been when that company in particular was crying out for a star. And even if maybe hindsight would suggest he wasn't one, like, I believed him to be one. I think most fans watching believed him to be one, and that went a long way in 2007.
And am I right in thinking the Mr. Kennedy storyline also has an interesting little wrinkle around, obviously, the rumours about him being McMahon's illegitimate son, and then eventually that building to some big fight over control of WWE as well at WrestleMania between him and Triple H?
Well, it's really telling because he didn't have the briefcase by then, and yet they still had him pegged to be Vince's kid for that exact storyline. So there's twice now where the company have thought, we're going huge with you at next WrestleMania. A time when they would still look 12 months ahead to a story. It's the sort of thing that would never happen now because they'd never be able to keep a character alive. But with two separate stories, they're thinking, you're going to be doing one of the biggest things this time next year. And then we get there and it just doesn't happen. And really, he never truly found that level again because, yes, he got a decent run in TNA off the back of his WWE stardom, but it was never to come back. Like when he was gone from WWE because of some enemies he made and some other things like that, he was gone. It wasn't just disappear off, find yourself, come back and we'll go again. Mr. Kennedy has never returned. It really was, well, it wasn't one and done, it was two and done for him.
I'm not saying Mr. Kennedy was unlucky, but if he fell in a barrel of tits, he would come out sucking his thumb.
Michael Sidgwick, what are some of your best WrestleMania matches that never happened?
All right, it's kind of ugly to approach this one because the circumstances as to why it never happened, like, render a wrestling match just completely and utterly pointless and not even worth discussion. But my God, what a pro wrestling match it would have been. Eddie Guerrero versus Shawn Michaels was mooted for WrestleMania 22. In the interest of taste, I will keep this completely brief, but, like, you think of in that era especially, just a more interesting dynamic than the parallels that those two performers had. They both had an irascible quality to their characters where in the ring, they were complete dickheads who were cheeky and they cheated and they were overtly heelish, and yet they were so beloved by the audience that they were almost like cheered for like how cheeky they were. It was considered a strategy and, oh, what are you like, but we still love you anyway. Can you imagine like a game of sportsmanship gone awry between these two guys and the various tricks they would play on each other to get the momentum, all of it packaged with the building story and the incredible athleticism that both men shared. It just would have been great, but I don't want to dwell on it too much because it just doesn't matter, does it?
On paper, though, that would have been arguably one of the greatest WrestleMania matches ever.
There was evidence to support how great it would have been by Shawn's match with Kurt Angle, like 21 as well. There was a loyalty to the brand split and to the likes of a wrestler like Shawn, where positioning him against somebody that you didn't think he would ever face up against had a dream match quality. It's obviously awful to think of the circumstances to why this didn't happen, but if you think about the tribute show with which they paid to Eddie Guerrero, they booked Shawn Michaels versus Rey Mysterio, which in itself was another sort of, it felt like, well, a dream combination in tribute to the man that will, another match that we'll never get. And Shawn had that quality at the time because we were only 3 years into a comeback that most people thought would never happen. So there was a lot of people to cycle through that could face Shawn Michaels. It was all dream match fodder. And Eddie Guerrero had become far more than he was, say, when he signed in 2000. He was the perfect kind of combination of an internet wrestling community favourite and a Vince McMahon sports entertainer by that point. So there's every reason to believe it would have been every bit as good as Sidgwick describes, because it offers the opportunity of portraying the best version of sports entertainment, really.
For my first pick for best WrestleMania matches that never happened, there's an element I want to suggest, John Cena versus The Undertaker. I realise that actually happened, but it never actually happened in the way we would maybe hope it would have, whether it be years back or more modern day versions.
Getting pissed in the crowd first?
No, strangely enough not. But I have to mention The Undertaker versus Sting. That feels like the elephant in the room here. It's a match we could arguably still get, maybe in a Saudi Arabia show down the road or something. You never know with the way things are with WWE right now, but I mean, you talk about
stem cells,
crossover stars, a match that when people spoke about the WCW buyout, this was the match that they were talking about. And obviously Sting took a lot longer to get to WWE than everyone else, considering his opinions of the company. But even when he came in, people were talking about that happening at a WrestleMania down the line.
I know you glossed over John Cena versus The Undertaker, because what we got, as much as I genuinely really liked the whole presentation of what was a glorified angle, I think nowadays you couldn't do the version of John Cena versus The Undertaker that people were almost apprehensive about, because John Cena isn't Super Cena anymore. The Undertaker's lost his streak. But before I get to Undertaker versus Sting, can you imagine Super Cena around 2010, and I know we wouldn't have got a Shawn Michaels match, or at least one of them, but can you imagine that version, that oppressive, invulnerable, transparently pushed at the expense of everyone John Cena against The Undertaker when he had the streak?
Yes.
They ran an angle in Madison Square Garden, and the reaction there bears that out. They were in a tag team together, I think against DX and another team in a triple threat, and then at the end, almost like in a kind of send the fans happy home moment, because they knew Madison Square Garden hated John Cena. It was the night that Kofi put Orton through the table. Undertaker just chokeslams him or tombstones him or whatever it is, and it's their first real interaction where you just see, you're still Super Cena, but you're not The Undertaker, you're not elite level Undertaker, and the reaction was incredible. It was spine-tingling.
Can you imagine the sheer online anxiety
panic
of
yeah.
Super Cena ending the streak?
Yeah.
Because as much as the streak was a work of genius, and on the night itself, because he was such a great worker, he was like the best one night a year worker in the world for years. The Undertaker was in the 2000s, the late 2000s, early 2010s. That just the notion of this John Cena ending the streak was so viable and so hated that the drama would have been genuinely electric and unbearable. It would have an atmosphere unlike any other. Undertaker versus Sting, my pro wrestling tastes never veer into the mythical or the supernatural or the mystical or any of that bollocks. It's just never ever been for me, even when I had no discerning qualities as a wrestling fan in the Attitude Era, when I was just sort of high on blood and violence and swearing and tits. I never liked The Undertaker and Kane as characters. It just wasn't for me, not my personal tastes. However, the idea of the angles that would have built towards near enough prime psychology of The Undertaker and Sting, even I would have marked out for that.
Again, the once a year stuff would really help, because you would need Sting maybe twice over a 12-month period to just rock up in some rafters and point a bat at The Undertaker. And then, there's your storyline, like, where's Sting, where's he going to be? That would service everything that kind of made the Hogan feud with Sting in WCW so cool. I completely agree. The darkness and the mythology and the magic of the Undertaker character has never really done it for me. But that's like saying that muscle guys don't do it for you and you can't enjoy Hogan Warrior. Undertaker Sting is the best version of that, and it was a dream match in a way that I think you would welcome the magic of it, because it would be a wonderful smoke and mirrors program, and with the streak being intact, I think you say about the anxiety of Cena, this is a nice opposite. There would be no doubt that on the night the Undertaker would defeat Sting, but it would be about getting to watch the spectacle rather than maybe even the one near fall they might get when he hits a Scorpion Death Drop or something like that. You wouldn't ever really buy it, but the magic of seeing it happen with WWE's production would easily haul your enjoyment over the line, easily.
What's another WrestleMania match that never happened that you think would have been spectacular?
It's downplayed in retrospect, because if this match had happened in 1989, and obviously circumstances did not permit it at all, but 1989 Ric Flair on such in-ring form, and he's again just exceptional on the mic, versus Hulk Hogan in 1989 at the peak of his household mainstream powers, that would have been perfect. The dynamic had changed for the worse by 1992, so much so that Vince McMahon quite famously just thought, well, Sid's hotter, which is quite crazy to think of just how big these two guys were.
He's like house show metrics some months early, didn't he? Just make a sort of relatively objective, boring decision.
Yeah.
It's not going to draw.
But the WWF at the time was just so... Once they'd realised that they were completely unassailable in their quest to monopolise the industry, they'd gone from building all of it around more or less an as-is AWA import and NJPW import in Hulk Hogan, and they obviously got people like Piper and everything to build the WWF. Once it became apparent that it had worked, WrestleMania had worked, once the territory stars started to trickle in, they weren't ever presented as on Hogan's level. And you saw manifestations of that with Dusty Rhodes and Harley Race and the Red Rooster. Once they'd realised, we've got the stars, and they're more or less synonymous with the WWF, we can start playing our bollocks arrogant game of, well, who are you? You came from wherever. It's not the great WWF. All that said, they promoted Ric Flair so perfectly. I remember watching VHS tapes of his 1991 introduction and just thinking, without any, I was literally 5 or 6 or 7, without literally any knowledge of what Ric Flair was, he just felt through the immaculate presentation like a disturbing presence who didn't belong, with the pixelated title.
Was such a visual, wasn't it?
Oh,
Yeah,
it was
the pixelated
fantastic.
title.
It just felt like, who is this?
Mm-hmm.
Where's he come from? Who is this star? And I think they could have got something out of Hogan versus Flair at SummerSlam, WrestleMania.
I think it's one of them things where there's a lot of misunderstanding when this is retroactively analysed, because the industry just worked differently. It didn't go that well on house shows. That was often how they would judge how well it would go to pay-per-view. This was going to be a big and important pay-per-view because it was seen. The bloom was off the rose for WWF, and WrestleMania 8 was in a giant venue, but just none of it was clicking in the way that it used to be. So Vince, in his infinite wisdom, went back to a drawing board that worked over and over again. A giant heel is going to turn on Hulk Hogan, and they're going to have a match at WrestleMania. You can sort of see why it would make sense. He put the title on Ric Flair, so it's like, well, this is great. I can use them both and get 2 main events instead of getting one. WCW kept it simple. Like 2 years later, Hogan had all the stink of the steroid trial, and Ric Flair was 2 years older because he was getting on in '92 still, and yet they drew a monster buy rate and kind of changed the direction of their organisation as a result. So even 2 years on from that, Bash at the Beach 1994 stands as relatively hard evidence that it would have worked at WrestleMania 8.
So disappointing, that one especially. What else makes this list for you?
I have a thing with there's Bret Hart being the greatest of all time. He was the best at everything ever, and there is loads of evidence to support that, and anyone that doesn't think that just needs to watch more of him to fully understand it. And over the years, Bret Hart's sort of WrestleMania legacy isn't talked about that much because he just happens to have the most important match in the history of the organisation, but beyond that, there's not a lot of like great chapters. So the Austin match is obviously always talked about, and the Shawn match is beloved in circles, but not in others, myself included. It doesn't work for me, I saw
in some lists when I was doing some research for this that people were saying Bret versus Shawn 2 should have arguably been is a WrestleMania match that never happened that should have.
We know why it didn't.
We know why it didn't, and what we got
Like, fate didn't conspire to deprive us of this match. Let's be perfectly frank and clear on that.
Bret Shawn 2 didn't happen, and Bret and Austin saved the entire company. So it's like you have to sort of go with how it went. But WrestleMania is sort of a weird legacy for Bret, because he calls his Bob Backlund match the worst match of his entire WWE career, and he had to work Yokozuna twice and do his very best, and the best was pretty damn good as well.
The 9 match is really good, but you never remember it for being good.
It's just not sort of really held up in any regard. But the 2 matches for him at WrestleMania 9, where Randy Savage was just sat there, like, calling the show with Jim Ross and Bobby Heenan, because Vince McMahon deemed him only a commentator now rather than a star from bygone era, even though he just panicked and brought back Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan...
He worked Crush the next year.
Yeah, like, it's infuriating that he's at the desk, let alone that he's not sort of working in a main event against Bret Hart. But also, Bret documents in his book that Vince had told him, and he was probably just selling him snake oil, that the Ultimate Warrior was there and ready to put him over. So you have 2 major stars from the bygone era. If you think of that era as Hogan, Warrior, and Randy Savage as being the guys to Vince McMahon, 2 of them were there potentially to put over Bret. Warrior ended up going in November because of an awkward situation with drugs and things like that, but Randy Savage was still there. They still could have done it, and instead the last one, Hogan, ended up taking the whole thing. And it just feels like if there was ever a time to strap Bret the Hitman Hart, it was at WrestleMania 9, and the attempt to do it a year later felt more like apology booking than it was he's my guy.
I understand what you're saying. Savage probably should have worked hard at WrestleMania 9. It would have been wonderful. However, his role on commentary did provide one of the all-time great, inadvertently funny calls of all time. He's commentated on the night in the match with Undertaker and Giant Gonzalez in a bid to present Gonzalez as this, like, mystical figure. Randy Savage goes, "Oh, gotta watch out. He's from down under." So he's from just Australia then. He's just from Australia. God damn it. I love Savage on commentary, even though it was a profound failure of how great he was and how much he still had to offer down under. I mean, that's just seminal patter.
What do you make of the argument? Obviously, we had the classic that was The Rock versus Hulk Hogan. What do you make of the argument that we should have got Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hogan instead?
He was too clever. He was too clever, and ultimately it worked out for the best. Steve Austin, as we have constantly said on this podcast, every single pro wrestler should go out right now, buy themselves a silver or gold bracelet, whatever precious metal you want, and engrave it with WWSCD. What would Stone Cold do? Because he's the most clever guy to preserve his own star power in the entire industry. He knew exactly who to work with, who not to work with. He pinpointed to the month that Triple H wasn't quite ready. By withholding that for a month, he got himself back over as not doing a job to a guy who wasn't quite ready because he was still talking like this. So Steve Austin didn't want to work Hogan at WrestleMania 8 because he was so clever and he knew exactly what was coming, and what was coming was just a complete tidal wave of total nostalgia. The match we got was perfect, and I wouldn't change it for the world. Absolutely. Like, there's a point where Hulk Hogan listens to the reaction, throws The Rock halfway across the ring, and then does the flex. The crowd just go ballistic. They go ballistic in euphoria that the guy they grew up has somehow returned. And Hogan has this look on his face where he's just looking around like that, thinking, this is mint. I'm a hero again. And the camera goes to The Rock. It's one of my favorite visuals in pro wrestling history, because The Rock is the coolest operator of all time. And you see his eye twitch.
Like
I've had this
involuntary micro expression, isn't it?
Yes, I've had this exact twitch happen to me when I've been in jobs that were really stressful, and he's literally The Rock in the middle of WrestleMania. This is happening to his eye, and I think he was one of the most selfless main event talents of all time. He'd put people over clean. He had just no compunction about doing things like this. Whereas with Austin, and this is not a complaint at all, more wrestlers should do this. The system doesn't allow them to do this. Mm-hmm. I think if he had of not listened to himself and been in the ring, I'm not saying he wasn't a professional or anything like that, I just don't think he would have conducted the moment quite like The Rock did.
I can't ever visualize the match working.
Mm-hmm.
Austin wasn't in the most selfless of form around 2002, around 2001, and he talks about like he was going through quite a lot of personal things, and I think he was feeling quite paranoid because the Attitude Era had kind of come to an end, and he was still a top guy, and he wasn't drawing anymore. But you look at there's some brilliant matches that he still has with the likes of Kurt Angle, but he gobbles him up in the body of the match as a heel when he should be like finally like selling for him and letting Kurt have a bit of shine. He doesn't really do it. It's a match on pay-per-view the month before WrestleMania against Chris Jericho that's a dog of a watch. Like nothing really happens, and he's losing to Chris Jericho, and it's almost like one long boo-boo face of a match. Austin would tell you on endless podcasts that he was deaf in one ear, so he would need to call a match, and he would like to go off the reaction of the crowd as to how it would go. But it's a minging watch. Like he's doing nothing for the world champion Chris Jericho in his last match before his big WrestleMania main event. It's as bad as the Triple H one at this WrestleMania that followed. So I can't see him doing a thing for Hulk Hogan. If that exact spot happens the way it does, if Austin dares to let him say, all right, then you can push me off for lockup, like they'll boo you, and then the reaction goes that way, and the crowd go nuts for Hogan, I say that version of Steve Austin kind of goes into panic mode and slows it all the way down, brother, and then stomps some mud holes. And like The Rock gave Hogan every single nostalgia pop, knowing full well he was going over at the end, knowing that there was opportunities for audibles to be called, which there were in the regards of the outsiders doing the running and all that sort of stuff. I don't think Steve Austin sees it that way at all. I think it's chin locks, headlocks, stunner, and we get the hell out of it.
Because with The Rock, after that one involuntary stress eye twitch, it's like after the twitch has a click in his head, it's like, right, this is what it is. Let's go with this story. And they don't completely like rewrite the match. There's just little moments where he's doing his ostensible babyface offense, but he's like gesturing to the crowd as if to say, no, I've got your man down here. He's not like appealing to them or being The Rock. He's kind of slowly doing a intra-match heel turn for the purpose of that one match because he recognised the magic of the moment.
It's like it's wider sort of the universe operates in funny ways. The Rock was about to leave again for Hollywood, so if there was ever he was always selfless, but if there was ever a position where he could like, I can just have a load of fun with this, it's not like I need to worry too much about the booking next week. Steve Austin was so stressed about the booking at the time that straight after this WrestleMania he walked out. He left for a week, he came back, and then he left again with the Brock Lesnar thing. This was him operating at his worst emotionally and physically. So again, like they couldn't have been further apart in terms of how to deal with the situation that Hulk Hogan was about to put in their lap.
One final match I have to mention since discovering that this was a thing, morbid fascination more than anything, is Brock Lesnar versus Shane McMahon. Now, for those who don't know about this, this was going to be a long-term storyline that started, of course, with Brock Lesnar caving Randy Orton's head in at SummerSlam, and it was going to lead to a match, I don't know, between the two men who got diverticulitis. I don't know what the storyline was going to be there, but there's a part of me, and it's probably a part of me that I hate, that would have loved to have seen Brock Lesnar versus Shane McMahon at WrestleMania.
Firmly agree. I love this idea as much as I hate it. I, in fact, love to hate it because I look at the post-match melee of SummerSlam 2016, was it?
Yeah.
I was thinking, who do you think you are? When Shane McMahon's like coming out at Orton's defense and like serving Brock Lesnar as if to say, too far, man. You're probably going to have to deal with me next.
That's one of my SmackDown superstars. I'm the administrator on that show.
And, you know, if you do that to him, you think you're going to have to step to me? Do you want that? Do you want that? And Brock Lesnar was like, well, no, because you can't throw a work punch. No one's going to take this remotely seriously. It's going to do damage to my brand to sell for your stupid worked punches, you jumped up little rich twat. No. And then Vince McMahon was like, looked at his son and just went, nah, you're right. You're all right, Brock. You're the real son. You're the real son. You're my real son.
Like one of them happy birthday tweets brought to life.
Can you imagine the build to this? Can you imagine Shane McMahon? Like,
he'd be in an MMA gym having like somebody punch his stomach. Like, remember this, Brock? Remember how this feels, Brock? Remember how this feels? The diverticulitis thing would definitely come up. Like,
Yeah.
They'd just be the hardest guy. Like, somebody that's knocked out Brock in UFC. Like, who was one of the guys?
Cain Velasquez.
Cain Velasquez. Maybe not him there. But, like, Cain Velasquez smashing him as hard as he can in the stomach.
Alistair
Something like
Overeem.
that. Alistair Overeem, like, smashing him in the stomach. Like, I'm ready for you, Brock. I'm ready for you, Brock.
He got John Jones' trainer when he was doing the big UFC training stuff. Shane McMahon. When he was...
Brock's got 14 suplexes and he beat the streak, but Shane McMahon does this.
it's just the idea of Shane McMahon thinking he is hard from 2016 till 2019 was one of my lowest ebbs as a WWE fan. I just couldn't take it remotely seriously. It wasn't just the work, which was putrid. Absolutely rotten.
Yeah, this was following that Undertaker match.
I know.
In terms of
Like,
WrestleMania.
rotten on a putrid technical level. Just the sheer pitch of, I'm Shane McMahon and I'm your hero and I'm really hard. I just hate him.
Was that the WrestleMania that instead we got Shane versus AJ?
Yes, because he was the mirror McMahon at the time. So in Hell in a Cell, he was as hard in Hell in a Cell as The Undertaker. The following year, he was as good a wrestler as AJ. That was the story. And look, that's a
He did Kushida spots.
I would have loved that though. Him sitting down with Brock and going, so do this. And then obviously I nail a shooting star press. And it's like, whoa. Against Brock at WrestleMania.
We've talked.
That would have been pretty tits, actually.
It's like in talking about WrestleMania builds, there's always like there's the guys in the fuse and then there's the setup guys. I love that you build a sports entertainer from the ground up and then you open his head on the ring and that's all a setup for Shane McMahon. like, this is the guy that they push, but he's the B guy for Shane McMahon's A story.
Madness. Absolutely insane that could have happened. But let us know your best WrestleMania matches that never happened in the comment section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts. Plus, let us know your thoughts on Twitter at WhatCulture WWE Watch. They can follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
Follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
Follow me at Adam Wilborn. As I said, follow us all at WhatCulture WWE. This has been Get the Table. My thanks to the Dadley Boyz. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.